that's also what I'll be covering a lot of today, where we'll look into specific email security and what we can do to help protect our end users and help protect our email domains against spoofing, phishing, and some of the technologies out there that we can configure to help mitigate that our domain is used for spoofing attacks and so on. And I'll dive into the Defender for Office 365 as well, how this can help us along the way to protect our end users. I have some demos of some of the technologies along the way as well. If you have questions along the way, don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A on the chat, and we'll pick up all the questions in the end. So what are we really talking about when we want to protect users against phishing attacks? There are some terminologies we need to get in place first. If we look at phish or phishing, it's typically when someone is trying to do an attempt to disguise themselves to obtain some sensitive information from our organization. Some of this is achieved through spoofing of emails as well, where they try to forge an email to pretend they are someone else than they really are. So usually an email that comes into our organization might look legit, but it's not. There could be some forgery on the email address where it's actually it might be our email domain, but it's forged. And the reason why people can do that, we'll look into that a little later here. But attackers can also use email domains that just look a lot like your own domain, and therefore try to spoof some recipient or some senders in your email domain. So it looks like they are coming from the CIO or the head of finance to someone internally in the organization, but the email is actually coming from the outside. And that's some of the impersonation techniques they use in these phishing attacks. So how do we actually mitigate this? We need to sort of authenticate that the sender of the emails we receive is really the sender. And a way of doing that is using some technologies that is publicly available for everyone, because it's part of the RFC framework for emails and so on. It's the Sender Policy Framework and something called Domain Key Identified Mail. And we have a technology called DMARC as well. I'll dive into all these technologies in detail later to so you get the idea of how they actually work and why it's important for us to have these in place to mitigate, especially spoofing of our email domains. So what type of phishing attacks do we see out there? Some of them might be clone phishing. It could be that they're hooking into a correspondent of emails that is already there and trying to sort of clone an existing conversation. So it looks almost like the actual email that was sent, or it's more like they cloned the conversation and is trying to follow up on a conversation that might already have been closed on email. Another way is what's called the spear phishing, where the attackers is trying to pinpoint exact individuals in the company and sort of spear phishing attacks directly at them. And if those individuals is at high level, like the on CX level, it's also often called veiling. And this is the type of phishing attacks that we typically see out there. And the way, if you look at some of the statistics around phishing, the way they try typically to disguise the content that they are trying to attack with when they are sending emails into our organization is typically emails disguised as it could be delivery failures, it could be invoices, it could be scanned documents like package deliveries gone wrong or package deliveries that needs to be confirmed. And often malicious attachments might be included in those emails, and those attachment could be Office documents, it could be archives, it could be malicious PDF documents, and so on. So that's typically how we see malicious email or phishing emails directed at individuals in our company. So if we take a step back and look at what the main issue here is, well, for once, sending email over SMTP has always and is by default anonymous. So we have no way of actually by default making sure that all communication is primarily encrypted. There are ways to, but that's a completely different session to go into encrypting emails to specific senders. But by default, all emails is considered unencrypted and anonymous. And this is also why it's quite easy for someone to actually send an email and pretend that it's coming from somewhere else, and thereby spoofing the email. And how we can mitigate this is by using some of the techniques that I'll be diving into here. Another way to make sure that our email is healthy and consistent is making sure that whatever bulk email or marketing email systems, or if we need to send out bulk emails, don't use our primary mail systems for this. Use services that are designed for this to make sure that you have communication going out from major senders like SendGrid and MailChimp, which are major in providers in this area. Because if something happens with these emails, or they get blacklisted or anything else, you're sure that these emails came from those services, and thereby they're not starting to blacklist your email and your email services, because we all know how important the email is. So it's hard to live with our system if we get blacklisted in the targeted recipients. Of course, this can be quite complex to implement if it's implemented badly. So I'll try and outline all this so to get it as easy as possible, and where to start off to make sure we do this right. So first off, we need to make sure that emails are authenticated. Of course, Office 365 or the Exchange Online is trying to look into the emails that we receive and making sure they are authenticated. And a way of doing that is to make sure that the SPF, the DKIM, and the DMARC records are in place. So what we can do is make sure we have all these records in place for our own domain here. So what's important to begin with is that the SPF, the Sender Policy Framework, needs to include whatever systems is sending email from our domain. So in my scenario with my company, Neo Consulting, I need to make sure that the neoconsulting.dk domain space has the SPF records in place. So I need to make sure that on the include list we have here, that I include the Office 365 services and so on. By doing that, I'm confirming to whoever receives email from me that as long as it's coming from like the Office 365 services, we have that up in the end here with protection.outlook.com. When it's coming from that, the email is coming from a service that I have make sure is valid when we're talking about my domain. If I have specific custom services like IP addresses from on-prem systems and so on, well, I have to mark those here in these systems. And also if we use bulk services like MailChimp or other marketing services or CRM systems like Salesforce, we also need to include those in the system. So an SPF record can easily become quite long, and as long as we include it will sort of be expanded, and behind that there will be a lot of IPs as well. And if we have a lot of includes and we have a lot of IPs, we can run into some other issues with the SPF, like it's getting too long, or the lookups it's too long. But if in those scenarios, we'll have to look into sort of some auto expanding services that is provided out there on the internet. But that's a different story. To begin with, make sure you have whatever systems that you use for email, like Exchange Online. We have the protectionoutlook.com. If we use Salesforce, we have Salesforce in here, or the IP addresses that we need to send with. Next off, we have the DKIM. The DKIM is sort of the signature that gets into our email. And that signature is sort of unique, and we put that in the DNS to make sure that whoever receives the email from me can look it up and in the DNS and sort of confirm that the email I sent is actually the same as the string in the header of my email. And combining all these is the DMARC. You can look into the DMARC as sort of an umbrella that puts all the technologies together. With the DMARC, I myself can design that or specify what policy you on the other end should enforce on emails coming from my new consulting.dk domain. So in this scenario, we have in the example here, the policy is set to reject. And we have 3 different stages here that we can set it into, and I'll get into those a little later. But putting into reject, I'm sort of confirming that whoever receives email from my domain, if it's not coming from the servers that I listed to begin with in the SPF record, you should just reject the emails coming from my domain. So that's another way for me to actually making sure that whoever is trying to spoof emails from me, if they're not coming from email domains that are already put into the SPF record, and based on the policies that I marked in my DMARC record, well, then the emails will be rejected on all the receiving email servers. So that's one way that we can make sure that we can authenticate our own email domain. And of course, with the complete set of all these technologies, and especially the DMARC to enforce whatever the receiving end should do with our email, it's important that that we all do this, because if we all do this and we all do it right, it's very hard for anyone out there to actually spoof the emails based on any of us.
Are you freezing? What is wrong? Oh, you're freezing. Come here.
Just a second here.
Did you just come in from outside, Bubba?
Oh, I muted everyone. Good. So next off is, of course, it's important that we have this in place. If we look at some of the statistics, organization out there is becoming better, and especially with the pandemic and all that, it seems like a lot of organizations had done a lot of work the last couple of years, actually trying to enforce the DMARC policies. But there's still a lot of organizations out there that is not using it, so there's still a lot of work to do in this space. If we look into the stats, which is a little over a year ago, based on the Agari reporting stats, 24% is actually not using DMARC record at all, and some might have in sort of implemented the first step where they have the policy in none, and that's 44%. So basically, with the DMARC in none, I have decided that I set up DMARC for my organization, but I put the policy in none. So thereby, I'm not enforcing the receiving organization to do anything with the email if it seems to be spoofed. So I let that be decided by the receiving end. If their systems or anti-spam system seem to detect that it might be spoofed or anything like that, they will do whatever they think or whatever the systems in the other end think. If I had enforced it with either quarantine or reject, like the 24 and the 8% is doing, then I've made a decision for my own company. Of course, it's not easy to get to that step, especially if you are a large and even a complex organization, because you need to begin with to make sure that you have all email sending systems included in your SPF. So that's a bit of a journey to get there, but never late than ever to get started on this. Let's look into the details of how it looks visualized if someone is sending. The sender SPF framework here. I'm sending an email with the with my email domain, and the recipient is receiving it over here. So the first thing they'll do is they'll check the DNS server on the internet and look up my published SPF record to confirm that the email server that is sending my email is actually authorized to send email with my domain. If it is, it's passed on and ends up in the end user's mailbox, which is perfect. If by some reason it doesn't add up, it will be rejected and put into spam. Next up here is the DKIM. The DKIM is where I publish a DKIM public key. With the Exchange Online, we need to, if you're not already done it, you need to actually make sure that it's enabled on every email sending domain you have in Exchange Online. And when you do that, you sort of get the text value you need to publish in the DNS for each email domain. So when I'm sending an email with my domain, it's basically signed in the email header with that private key. So when the recipient gets that, it can see that there is a DKIM header included in the email, and it can look it up in the public DNS and confirm that the public key is matching the signature in the email. And based on that, I'm actually sort of being authenticated and passed on to the inbox of the end user. If it's not included, it will probably be rejected by the spam filter on the other end. And if we combine that with the DMARC, so we have the SPF in place, we have the DKIM in place. Next up here would be our DMARC policy. So I'm sending an email as before. The sending email is including the DKIM header on the email, and our receiving end receives it. Of course, it goes through all the standard tests that typically anti-spam systems and email system does. But next up, it will validate the DMARC. So it will try to confirm that we have the DKIM header in place by looking up the DNS. It will confirm that the SPF looks correct based on the systems is actually published in our SPF record for our public DNS. And next up, it will have a look at the DMARC policy for my email domain. And based on the policy I'm using in our DMARC, it can be either none, reject, or quarantine. So if everything adds up, the email is just passed along and delivered to the end user's inbox. If it doesn't add up, based on the policy setting that I put into my DMARC policy, I'm directing what the recipient email server should do with my email. If it should put it into quarantine, or if it should put it into basically rejecting the email server. The state of quarantine and reject, it depends a little on the receiving email systems that is actually being used out there. Most systems know how to read those policies. Some system will just always quarantine. It depends on the email system. That's basically the technologies around the sender policy framework and the policies around DKIM and DMARC. So they are all a very important part of making sure that the emails we are sending is authenticated and that our email domain is not being spoofed, and especially also not being spoofed so that our internal end users is sort of being spoofed by our own domain by emails or attackers using them from the outside of our organization. So it's not just important when you send out to anyone on the internet, but it will also help protect your internal users against phishing and especially spoofing with your own domain. But that's not all in terms of protecting our end users. Another important part, of course, is the technologies that is available in Office 365 and Exchange Online. We have different set of features and technologies available here. Basically, everyone with a mailbox is getting Exchange Online protection, which is sort of the broad broader protection that makes sure that volume-based and bulk mail and basic attacks is mitigated. As soon as those attacks becomes more intelligent, like impersonation emails, spoofing emails, and zero-day malware, and advanced phishing emails, and business email compromise, and so on, we'll need to take a step up and use the features which is part of Microsoft Defender for Office in Plan 1. This is where we get all the advanced protections, which of course needs to be configured. Some is sort of by a default setting, but you need to tweak some of it so it fits your organization as well. And like with a lot of other services in Microsoft 365, we have different plans here, and with Microsoft Defender for Office, we also have a Plan 2. The Plan 2 is sort of the advanced step above 1, where we'll be adding a lot of investigation and hunting services. We have some automation, and something that's very valuable, especially around end user protection, is simulation of attacks and also training of end users. And we'll have a look into some of these features as well. So where are we in terms of Microsoft Defender for Office, in terms of how good is this product? Well, some of the latest stats and reporting I saw based on this, I put it into the slide deck, is from Q2 last year, and it seems like Forrester put the Microsoft Defender for Office into their quadrant, and Microsoft is definitely up there as one of the leaders in terms of product that protects our email gateways. So it's a strong and great product, and it depends on where you are on the level in terms of Plan 1 and Plan 2 and so on. There's no doubt that if you have the Plan 2, you might be in a better place than if you had none of the MDO services and just use the Exchange Online protection. In terms of where it's included, you can buy either Plan 1 or Plan 2 as separate products, but they are also included. The E is included in the E3 series, and when you get up to the E5, you'll get the Plan 2 included in your service subscriptions. So when we have a look at the Defender for Office, it's a complete protection stack. So the first layer is basically our edge protection. And this is also a lot of the services up here is what's the basic part that's including Exchange Online protection. So anyone with a mailbox is protected by these basic services. As soon as we get down to the sender intelligence and the post-delivery protection, this is where we see the Defender for Office features that come in place. I'll not deep dive into any one of these, but it's just for the overview purpose of how many different services are out there and how many you can dive into each one of them, or almost each one of them in the policy settings, and tweak a lot of these yourself for your own company. So what happens if we are receiving a spoofed email in Exchange Online? Well, basically the email goes in and it has a look at the authentication of the email, and as part of this, then it goes through the process that I described earlier with the sender policy framework and the DMARC settings. So we need to make sure that the email that goes in has a good reputation, and it does that by looking up these technologies. And that's the basic part of the Exchange Online protection. If we have a look at the advanced authentication of the email, it also uses some machine learning, and with the MDO, we get something called the Antifish policy. The Antifish policy is an advanced phishing policy filter where we can add specific users to this policy to make sure that they are even more guarded and protected by especially phishing and impersonation attacks. So to begin with, this policy is mostly targeted at the CX level in the organization because it was limited how many people we could actually put into these policies. But with the ongoing extension of the services and so on, the last time I checked, we can now have 350 people in our organization added to this policy, and I'll show you where we'll find it and how we can add people in there. So we can configure all this in the Office 365 security, and some of it we can configure using the PowerShell as well for those of you who like that part. So we have email coming in from the internet. So first off, what's checked is that the authentication of the email looks okay. We have some specific domain spoof detections that is being validated. We have the impersonation detection, both first off on the user level. Does it look like, for me, Peter at New Consulting DK, is it being impersonated? For me, if I'm sending email from my private domain, well, my display name is the same. I have an email address privately that looks a lot like my company email. So it will mostly take out on the user impersonation detection. And depending on the settings here, we can nowadays also have Outlook sort of come with a mail tip that shows the end user that the email you just received looks a lot like you, basically. So the end user should be aware. We also have the possibility with the impersonation here to do checks or add domains that it needs to be aware of in those policies. Then it goes to the standards checks like antivirus, URL checks. Microsoft uses machine learning models to determine if the emails that your end users are receiving seems legit. So if I'm used to communicate with specific customers, it will learn by that in the models. And if suddenly one of those end users is being phished and is sending an email to me, the machine learning models will also learn based on those. And next up will be sort of mitigation of zero attacks, like the zero auto purge, where it also picks up attachments, and it will basically do separate scans of the email attachment. So you might already experience where an attachment is coming in, but it's basically not available to the end user yet because it's being scanned. As soon as the scan is done, the email is then being updated and will include the full attachment. And that's one of the steps we see right here. Next off is looking into safe links, basically the links that's included in the email, if they seem legit. And based on all this, it will be validated and delivered to the inbox of the end user. If it's not being validated, it will be sent back in the user quarantine area, and then basically based on alerting and so on, it can be available. It could also be that the user reported some of the emails back using the report message button that we can put out, make available to the end users in Outlook. I'll show you a little about that later. So to start using the Defender for Office, we need to make sure that we can get it configured and so on. A good step to start, if you have the licenses in place for MDO P1 and P2, would be to have a look at the configuration analyzer. It's part of the threat policies in the security portal. It's also available. Basically, the configuration analyzer is a lot based on a PowerShell script called Orca, Office configuration analyzer, which is basically a PowerShell script you can run against your tenant, and based on that, it will show you a report with recommendation and what looks okay, and your health index, which is what I will show you a bit of here. So depending on how you would like to work with this, you can use the PowerShell, you can use the portal directly in the security portal. So I've gone through a lot here, and it might sound a bit hard, and where do we start and so on. Basically, we need to start off with the SPF and DKIM and the DMARC, because eventually they will be important, especially around making sure that the domain you have and the email you're sending based on your domain is being authenticated. Next off is a good place to start in Office 365 with the Defender for Office, making sure we have the anti-spoof and anti-phishing policies in place. It's always good to push something back to the end user, because we need to make sure that the end user is good educated here. And a way of doing that and making sure that the end users communicate emails back to us as soon as they see something that might be look like phishing or spam or something like that. A way of doing that is using the report message plugin for Outlook. It's available directly within the apps of Outlook, so it can be the Outlook desktop version, it can be the Outlook on web. And with that button, users can basically click on it, and the email will be submitted back to Microsoft, but it will also be submitted back to the portal where you as the admin can actually see what the end user submitted back. And based on that, you can set it as a false positive, or you can submit it back to Microsoft from there. And we can have a look into that as well. So I have a little demo ready here. Let's start off with the SPF, DKIM, and DMARC part here. So let's start off with there's different services available on the internet to actually confirm how your SPF record look. You can do some NS lookup and have a look at the DNS record and so on yourself. In my scenario, I'll just use my own domain here. So if I type in new consulting, and I'll just zoom in so you can basically see what this is all about. I've typed in the domain, and in my scenario, I'm using a relaying service here, and I'm using Exchange Online. So these are the two systems that is basically allowed to send email based on my own email domain. If I've been using MailChimp, I needed to include that as well. If I had say on-prem systems, I could either add those as an include with the DNS record of those email servers, or I could add IP addresses for those. And based on that, we need to make sure we have a setting here that defines what the end, the system I'm basically sending email to, what they need to do if receiving email from me and the email is not coming from any of the systems that I provided here. I put it in basically fail mode, so if the email is not coming from Exchange Online or the MailHub system, well, it should just fail on the other end, and basically it will typically end up in a quarantine. So that's the SPF. Basically, in terms of reputation, you will need to do this with all your domains, but of course start with the domains that you're using for email. Next off is the DKIM. So let's have a look. So when the other end is receiving an email from me, I need to do it another way here. I send a test mail to my Contoso lab here from my own email address. And as I mentioned earlier, when I'm sending an email, the DKIM key is provided in the header of my email, and we can see that by looking into the email header. And what I wanted to do basically is to analyze the header that was coming from my email server. Let's have a look. We'll have a look here. The SPF was set to pass, so it was validating that the email I sent is included in the SPF. Next off, we have the DKIM header. Let's see where we have that. The header up here was validated, and it will then mark the header as DKIM passed. So the signature based on my email when it was coming into this tenant is set to pass because my DKIM header is matching the values that I have in my public DNS. So next off is to have a look at the DMARC for my email domain. So this is the standard setting for the DMARC. The next step here is the P, which stands for policy, and I've set it to reject. And then mentioned earlier, we have 3 different stages. We have none, which basically puts the DMARC and my DMARC policy in monitoring mode. So by including the none setting here, I'm not affecting any email traffic or anything to begin with. That only starts when I put it into reject or put it into quarantine, because then I decide that the receiving server of my emails should do something about my emails if they're not coming from servers that I defined within the SPF. And this is a policy around subdomains. I've set that to the same. Next off is some reporting here, and oh, that's very good. That reporting, like the RUA and the RUF, is going back to a service called DMARC Input, which I've been using for some testing for a while. Basically, that information is, so when receiving servers is receiving email on you, they are statistically responding back with information about how your emails are received. So by just implementing DMARC, you basically implemented in the dark and does not really know if it has value or if it works or if you have included all email sending systems into your SPF and your DMARC. So as part of this, I usually recommend using some DMARC reporting services. There's a ton of them on the internet. Most of them is does cost money. You can usually start off by free on some of them where they pick up the reporting, but if you really want to do the advanced forensic parts and so on by investigating the emails, you usually have to pay a fee for using those services. Next off is some of the other settings of how much it needs to report back. I said that I wanted to report back 100%, but that's not 100% of the emails I'm sending. It's still statistically. So if I'm sending a Google server, it might report back like 20% of the times to my reporting service. So it's just a snippet of all the emails that your organization is actually sending. But you will need some kind of email service to reporting service to get the full overview of this. I'll show you a little about that a little later here. Next off here, let's dive into to our end user here. I mentioned the report message. It's part of the add-ins in Outlook. So if I add it here, it will also be added in Outlook on the desktop. As the admin, you can go into the settings of your Office 365 portal and actually enable this, and it will automatically be available for all your end users in both Outlook on the web and Outlook on the desktop. So how does that look for the end user? Well, basically, let's have a look here. We have an example of something that might look like a phishing email in Spanish that arrived in my test user Megan here. So it's a bit small, but let's zoom in. In Outlook on the web, the report message is located up here. So if I want to report this email back, I can click here and I can report the message as junk, phishing, not junk, and have different options here. It takes a while before it ends up in the portal, but I ran through the process a little earlier. So how does this actually look on the other side of this? Well, as the admin, we'll have to go into the Security Admin Center. And from here, we have a full dashboard of a lot of services and policies that is email related. So on submissions, we will be able to see user reported messages. So this is where we as the admin can see all the emails that is being reported back from the end users here. It takes a while for the portal to pull it up here. So that's my example here. And then I can actually say, well, it looks might look okay, or we can submit it further to Microsoft for analysis if this is something that we want Microsoft to take care of in the future as well. Next off, in here we have the Microsoft Defender for Office. So the first place to start working with this is under policies. And if we go into threat policies, this is where we have all the policies for our email security available. And a good place to start is the configuration analyzer, because the configuration analyzer looks into your environment and looks at standard recommendations that you potentially can do around the settings of your environment. So that's a very good place to start, sort of like the secure score for your tenant, but this is strictly around email, anti-phishing, and anti-spam and antivirus and so on. Let's have a look at the anti-phishing policy. I mentioned the impersonation earlier. So with the MDO, we have a specific anti-phishing policy here. It's located under threat policies and under anti-phishing. We have a default policy up in here, and that default policy, we customize that, or we can create additional anti-phishing policies. In my scenario here, you can see impersonation user protection is currently set to off, and impersonation domain protection is set to on. So if I want to tweak this, and also the intelligence is already set to on, but this is where you customize it. So go into to edit here, and you can see what you can tweak here. So basically, the first part is the impersonation level. This is where we'll be adding users that we really want to protect. So if we have people on CXO level, people in finance, legal, people we know who's a specific target for either individual phishing attacks or the whaling attempts, we will include those people in here because they will be getting that enhanced impersonation protection. We can also add our email domains in here just to verify which domains we own. So it will always be a good place to add your domain, and then maybe along the way add users who is specifically targeted towards those phishing attacks. Of course, we have the mailbox intelligence, and this is where we have the artificial intelligence of Microsoft that determines the based on specific email patterns and how our users emails and who they communicate with, use that information to actually learn more about your organization to actually help protect your organization. This is recommended to have a look at this and go into the settings here. Next off, time is running off here, but I'd love to explain a little about, beside all the technologies and what we can tweak on the admin side, user information is very important as well. And one way of making sure our users know how to navigate in the phishing space is adding training and also adding attack simulations. So we can go in here if you have the MDO P2 license. The attack simulations and training is available for your organization, and you can go in here and launch a simulation. That simulation could be that we want to do some credential harvesting. So we'll choose that. We'll do a harvest campaign here. Next. And then we'll have to choose what the payload should be and what language the payload should be in. Do we want it to be like a DHL shipping confirmation? And there's 100 or so templates to choose from in here. And then we need to make sure that do we want to simulate against all the users in our organization, or do we just want to hit some of them? In the beginning here, I want to target Megan, a test user. And then you can also decide if you want to add training. So when they've completed, especially if they failed, they will be presented with training they can go through to get further knowledge around this. We'll just use the default landing page. No delivery notifications. And we'll launch the simulation right away. You can also do basically send a test, and then a test will be sent to the admin that is logged into the portal right now. I will brief look and see if she received an email that's not coming yet. But basically it could look like something like this. It's a malware simulation that I did earlier. So in this case, she received something that looks like a scanned document, and it's not. So this is how we can use the tools available in the Security Center. And you can always follow the campaigns you run in here. So let's go back to the slide deck and wrap up here. So as part of the DMARC, it's very important that you do that in steps. And start off by using the policy none, because then you're in monitoring mode. Evaluate, then set it to quarantine, evaluate again, put it in reject and evaluate, and then basically keep monitoring, because it's not just a system that you put a policy in and then go and forget. You have to, from time to time, to get back and see how it's running. And one way of confirming what's running is using a report analyzer tool that's available. And I always recommend my customers to have a look at some of the tools available on the internet, like DMARC and DMARC Analyzer, Easy DMARC, just some of them, or the MX Toolbox that I just used here. An example of a report could be something like this, where we basically get a report back based on our domain, telling me that, well, in this scenario, a lot of them seems to be DMARC capable, but some users actually received email from me that was non-DMARC capable. And could it be that I've set up SPF and all that and forgot about a system that my marketing department uses? And could that be why? And that's why it's important with these reports, because you actually find messaging systems out there and then get them identified, and later on can put them into the SPF and so on. I can see time is running up here, so I'll briefly run through these. But as briefly mentioned, user awareness is important. So run simulations, do phishing awareness training for the end users, making sure they have a place to report all this. So to wrap up, best practice, make sure you have a good design of your mail flow, had a good overview of that mail flow and the emails domains that's being used, so you know if you're using SendGrid or any bulk email service providers out there, or internal system that needs to relay email out to the internet. Make sure you get SPF, DKIM, and DMARC in place, and do it for all your domains. And with Office 365, configure the phishing policies and use the configuration analyzer part to follow up if your configuration seems to be in place. And this is just some examples of SPF. Other ways of protecting our end users is multi-factor, conditional access, looking into passwords and stuff. Lessons learned from all this in my session is that the SPF, DKIM, and DMARC is very important, especially around the authentication of your email domains. Plan your DMARC carefully. Start using the Defender for Office, because it's had some good features and some good tools in there. Don't forget the user awareness campaigns, and follow up with attack simulation and phishing campaigns directed against all your users. That's basically what I have, and let's the last couple of minutes open up for questions if there is any. I hope you enjoyed the session.
Thank you so much. This was great. I really think that people, at least in my point of view, is that people aren't aware of these little things, little gotchas, especially when they're trying to do so much at the same time. Like, I know myself, I'm guilty of that multitasking, doing 7 things at the same time, and you're looking at something, and it could really, if you're not aware or not hyper vigilant, these can be gotchas.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And I definitely see out there that a lot of people is already there with the SPF and maybe also with DKIM, because Microsoft basically makes you do it going through the configuration of Office 365 and Exchange Online. But a lot of organizations haven't got there with the DMARC. Maybe some have started, as I mentioned in the session as well, and then we started and forget all about it. So we still have the policies none. So it's actually not fully in place and fully into production to actually protect the authentication of our domains yet. So it's worth looking into.
I completely agree. All right. Well, if nobody has any questions, we're just about at time.
That sounds good. If any questions comes up later, you're more than welcome to shoot me an email or find me on Twitter. But otherwise, thanks for having me, and I hope everyone enjoyed the session.
Thank you so much. Everyone have a great day.
You too.